Hello and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with my two co-hosts.
I'm Jeff Poole.
And I'm Joe Lalo.
And we have a good guest for you this week, the week before Christmas, December 2018, for those who have been requesting dates. Ramy Vance. Ramy, I hope I said it right. He's a Canadian who lives in Edinburgh with his... Actually, you said Egyptian Canadian, I believe, that lives in Edinburgh with his wife, his 3-year-old. What's that?
Yeah, sorry, no one ever believes it when I tell people I'm half Egyptian, but it's just because I've been genetically engineered to infiltrate your society. So, hello.
There you go. You're doing a good job. You cannot be dark it all out of you anyway. All right, and he enjoys a beautiful city, whiskey, and long walks. Despite 15 years in traditional publishing, where he ran his own firm that focused on metadata, digitalization, and library services, he chose to go indie for his own work. Today, he writes kick-ass urban fantasy thrillers set in the GoneGod world, and his main series is Mortality Bites, though he's tried a couple other things that before focusing on this. So we're going to ask him about his current series and his other projects, and he's had some good success with the Mortality Bites series, so hopefully you guys will be interested. Welcome to the show, and is there anything I missed there in the intro when I was mangling things?
No, that was pretty good. It's great to have that introduction, so thank you.
You're very welcome. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got into maybe first the publishing in traditional, and then what got you excited about urban fantasy and genre stuff?
Yeah, so I guess my story in publishing actually started in 2004, where my business partner and I at the time, this is pre-Kindle and pre-ebooks and all of that stuff. We got it into our heads that we could create something called, we had read a stat that at the time there was 4 million books that were out of print. So we thought, well, with the digital age and PDFs, right, this is, pre-Mobi and EPUB and all that stuff, that we could start a company called Second Chance Publishing. We would take all the out-of-print books and we put them for sale as ebooks. So, 2004, genius idea. Needless to say, that did not work at all. That company crashed and burned within 6 months. But from that company was born another company called Kutub Arabiya. Kutub Arabiya is Arabic for Arabic books. So very original name. And what we did was, because I'm half Egyptian and my business partner at the time is Saudi, and so we used our kind of connections in the Middle East and we started digitizing Arabic content. And the idea was, again, to kind of be an ebook store for Arabic. That also, that actually did quite well in the beginning. But what we discovered was the market was actually in providing to libraries and services. So I've been in traditional publishing for the last 15 years, providing libraries and services with Arabic content, and also metadata, which is a big thing that kind of is a big focus in traditional publishing that hasn't really seeped into indie publishing yet. We get our 7 keywords and our categories, and that's about it. So yeah, so that's where that business came from. And then in 2015, my wife told me she was pregnant, and I'd always wanted to write, so I figured it was now or never. So I, did the responsible thing, and I sold my bit of the business, and I started writing. And I was one of those guys who, I was doing the serialized thing, kind of following the Hugh Howey model. And I had early success in 2015. Late 2015, and then I kind of got distracted by other things. Things kind of fell off the cliff, and so I went to 20 Books London, which I don't know if any of you attended, and it was absolutely eye-opening as to what was possible. So I decided to reboot my publishing career. I unpublished everything I did. There's a video on 20 books of me unpublishing everything, and if you could see my face, you'd see me kind of crying as I was doing it. It was just I rebranded everything and started fresh, and I released the Mortality Bites series, I pre-wrote 6 books back to back before releasing anyone, did the whole rapid release thing, and kind of took it from there. And things have been going pretty good. That.
That's pretty good to write 6 books and hold on to them. We've advised 3 before, and I know that's really hard for a lot of folks, especially if you're writing a novel a year. But it sounds like you had some experience by that point.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, the GoneGod world, which was the original series, so Mortality Bites is set in the same universe as GoneGod world, and at that point, the GoneGod world had a fan base, and it had I had somewhat of a following, but I wasn't doing anything close to what a lot of these heavy hitters in the UF and kind of like the fantasy genres were doing, and so it kind of opened my eyes that like rebrand everything, re-release everything, and I kind of I went a bit crazy. I'll be honest. I pre-wrote the 6 books, and I remember reaching out to one of the heavy hitters in UF, and I said, like, "Will you support my launch?" And he goes, "I will support anyone who has the guts to write 6 books before releasing a single one." And it's like, okay, well, that works. So thank you. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. So has this been your full-time job for a while? Because you said your wife got pregnant and you sold your business. Were you able to like have some money set aside? So because that's kind of sort of the hard part about, saving your books and not publishing is that you're not making anything in the meantime.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because I actually fell into helping first-time writers with writing their first novel kind of stuff. And so that actually became kind of a runway where I was basically helping people plot their first books. And I would kind of call myself a plot doctor. And that actually took off incredibly well and became quite distracting from the actual writing process. And because there are a lot of people who really want to write that first book, they have that story in mind and they're really interested in getting it out, but they just have no idea how to actually build it into something that works. And so that was great. And also it was it was wonderful from the experience building perspective. It allowed me to plot. I mean, I've written now and released 11 books in the GoneGod world, but there are 25 books planned. And through that did that. So that was kind of the runway. But the way things are going right now, I'll probably be doing less of that, a lot less of that, and be focusing more and more on just writing. Although I do love working with first-time writers. I mean, the enthusiasm of that, I think we've all written however many hundreds of thousands of words. You remember that first time you're sitting at the keyboard. That's its own experience. So,
yeah, absolutely. Now, you're talking about planning, having 25 books planned.
yeah.
So do you plan out like in detail exactly what each of these books are going to be? Is the entire arc just sort of laid out for you before you start?
So what I do is I kind of treat them in seasons. So generally for me, 4 books is one season, and they'll be, to kind of steal the Josh Whedon term, a big bad that needs to kind of be conquered by book 4. And then in book 3 of that season, I'll start to introduce the next big bad, start to kind of pull it out and pull it through. But then you have the world hook, which is obviously, 25 books are all kind of leading to this one point. And then in this one point, every kind of sub-story or subplot kind of will, give the heroes of this world a chance to deal with what's coming. So I guess I should just mention, like, the GoneGod world, the premise is that the gods are gone, all of them. And when they left, they exiled all their denizens onto Earth. And so now our neighbors are things like minotaurs and centaurs and pretty much every mythical creature from, every religion and every mythology, folklore, living and dead, are refugees on Earth now. And you can probably guess that the 25 books will deal with the return of some of the gods. I don't think I'm letting too much. Sorry if I spoiled it.
Now, so let's say you have these 4 book chunks and everything like that. I guess that's sort of, does that give you any flexibility to sort of adapt a story if based on feedback or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, with the original GoneGod world, I had originally planned just the first 7 books for that. And in the first book, I had 2 scenes with Medusa, right? The Gorgon. But she's kind of this cute, lovable character. She's really sweet and funny. And so she literally appeared in about 1,000 words out of an 84,000 word book. And I got so much fan mail just on her that the second book entirely focused on her story. So, you do kind of pivot and it does kind of grow. Originally, it was, I think, 16 books originally, and it has expanded to 25. I don't think it's going to expand beyond that because one of the things I definitely have learned is that, it's easier to kind of really boost a smaller new series than kind of keep going that longer series. By the time you're hitting book 7 and 8, your read through better be spectacular. Otherwise, it makes more sense to do a new series within that world or within a new world.
A cute, pretty, sweet mermaid. I don't think I've ever heard those words all uttered together in the same sentence. Because all the instances of mermaid, or I'm sorry, not mermaid, but a Medusa, all the instances of Medusas I've ever heard are they don't turn to stone and they're evil. They got to chop their heads off. But so color me intrigued. But okay, so for those that might be confused about the differences between urban and epic fantasy, could you explain what makes a fantasy story urban?
Well, so that's really interesting. That there was a whole discussion on that, and I think Remind me, Lindsay, were you on that panel or?
I was on a panel about, I don't remember, it was just fantasy. It was with Jasmine Wall and Trad published author who gave me his book. I already forgot his name. I got to email him. But I think we might have brought that up.
Right. So, okay, so typically speaking, urban fantasy is that there is this undercurrent world of mythical creatures and magic that is kind of behind the veil. And then epic fantasy is magic and the mundane kind of coexist. There are dragons, there are wizards. We all kind of know they're there, and it's typically set in a medieval setting, right? So whereas urban fantasy would be set in a modern setting. However, I think that's kind of shifting, and really what urban fantasy, to me at least, is what do you call it? Magic in a modern setting, basically. So, but when I released the GoneGod world, everything was in front of the veil. It was all out in the open, and that seemed to really work. Like, people did appreciate that difference. So,
I do kind of think it's unfortunate that the term has become urban fantasy when contemporary fantasy would probably be better for what most of it is. But, oh well, those in the know, I guess they know. So I'm curious, I think a lot of folks, when they listen to the show and we talk about traditional publishing, especially in the US, we're thinking like New York based, maybe if you were involved, you were an editor or an agent, but you had a different route. I assume it was mostly nonfiction and it was Arabic language, right?
yeah, so I spend a lot of time traveling to the various book fairs, and traditional publishing is quite, it's a whole different world than this one. And quite frankly, indie publishing, we're much better at getting the whale reader, I guess is what the term is. That person who just is obsessed with, reading a book a week or even more than a book a week. We can provide that with rapid releases and the Kindle, just kind of building the series and not being constrained by the limitations of traditional publishing. Traditional publishing is much better at capturing the casual reader, that person who reads 2 or 3 books a year and that's it. But what my angle in the traditional publishing route was I was a service provider, because one of the things that traditional publishers for English, so obviously I was a service provider for the Arabic world, but this also exists in the English world, is that as a traditional publisher, a lot of times they would agree to print and distribute about 1,000 copies of your book sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, depending on the publisher. And they pretty much break even on your book through library sales. And so the library market is a huge part of the traditional publishing market. But in order to be eligible for the library market, you have to give those librarians, and I've been to a lot of librarian conferences, the stereotype is often true. Some of them are wild, but a lot of them really are, they want that metadata, and the metadata fields for a single book is upwards of 250 lines of different data, from the dimension of books to the weight to and. So traditional publishers have this ability to kind of just put their books out there and kind of get them everywhere in the library sense. And a lot of traditionally published books become popular because of their library presence. We as indies, we don't quite have that. Now, obviously, I was supplying it from a more academic Arabic side of things, but it was very interesting to kind of be in a part of that world and see how traditional publishers worked off of that.
Now you've got me curious if I should be putting in, when you upload your book to Ingram Spark, you can actually, there's a lot of stuff you don't have to click, but you can, that I assume ends up being part of the metadata. But I was just curious if going to all these fairs and kind of existing in that world, if it helped you when it was time to release your genre fiction independently.
Yeah, it was interesting, kind of, taking a look at the traditional side of things and looking at the how the indies did it. And one of the things that really wasn't useful was the mindset of the traditional publishing world, where, a single book would take up to 2 years really to see the light of day from when the author starts shopping it around to how traditional publishers tend to push their books. A lot of what traditional publishers do to push books are not really feasible for the indie author right now. So for example, getting into libraries, that's quite difficult. Now with programs like Overdrive, which you can enter with Draft to Digital, you can get your ebook into libraries, but it's not enough. What typically happens if you're going to get your physical book into a library, the first thing you have to do is get your book onto various catalogs. So Ingram is one of them, Gardner's is one of them, Nielsen is one of them, and then there's probably the most important of all, the one ring that binds them all, is WorldCat, so World Catalog. And once you kind of get your books sufficiently digested into these systems, then it becomes literally about pounding the pavement and getting, calling these librarians and calling these libraries and saying, will you take a few copies? And they'll take the copies, the physical copies, at a premium price, because, they're going to, that book is going to be digested by, potentially many people. But that part of the process of actually connecting with the institution is vital, because that's how books get discovered kind of on a grassroots level. And that's something that we just simply don't have the time for. A publisher, what they'll do is, because typically a publisher, especially a small size publisher or an imprint of one of the bigger publishing houses, they're only publishing, a couple hundred books a year. So they have these existing relationships already, and they're able to push them into the libraries and kind of get that connection there. So that's one thing that like indie publishers lack. I'm curious if that service will ever come to light, getting the physical book distribution into libraries. The other thing is subsidiary right trading, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. So subsidiary rights trading is pretty fascinating, because you literally will walk, the stock market exchange where you have all these people like yelling. So imagine a much more subdued version of that, organized by librarians. So it's basically tables and tables and tables of just rows of people who sit. The one in London Book Fair is probably twice the size of a football field. And all you're doing there is going around with your catalog, and you're trying to sell the foreign rights, or you're trying to sell the movie rights, or you're trying to sell the younger version rights, or the, whatever alternate format that you're looking to sell. And that's quite a huge thing to do. And you know, that's another way that publishers make their money, because a lot of times if they can just make 2 or 3 subsidiary rights sales, they've recouped their costs. And then of course the author gets a very minor cut of that recouping. What it has taught me is that PR is essential when kind of pushing your book. You know, you really, if you want to reach that casual reader, you really need to kind of get in front of them in places that they're used to digesting things. And, you know, and again, PR can be quite expensive if you're hiring a firm. There are ways to do it yourself. And some of those techniques I definitely have used for some local press and, you know, getting in panels, speaking, that kind of stuff. And it has been useful, and I've definitely seen spikes in sales. But ultimately, as an indie author, you know, that stuff is great to do. But writing that next book and getting that series, doing the regular rapid release, that's probably the most effective marketing strategy for us.
Yeah, I imagine there's a lot of introverts out there listening and saying, I could never go to those fairs and proposition these people with my stuff. And I'm right in there too. I'm so relieved that we don't, I mean, we can make a good living just on selling ebooks on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, and those guys. Even if you got to say, well, I'm huge on Amazon, even if, you know, like your neighbors never heard of you, even though they read fantasy, they're like, oh, what? You know, never heard of you. But hey.
But I mean, but think about that. That's absolutely insane, right? What you just said, because you have people like Michael Anderle, for example, who've sold millions of copies, but hasn't quite penetrated the public consciousness yet. And that's because, you know, the system is set up that you can catch that passionate reader who's going to read, you know, 3, 4, 5 books a week. But that casual reader, that's a lot harder to do. You really need to get in the systems. I mean, one of the great ways to do it, if you are interested, there is a couple of tools out there that are absolutely fantastic to use for this. So one of the tools is similarweb.com. So SimilarWeb is one of these obscenely expensive services, and I do not recommend paying for it. What it does is you enter a website and it will give you a bunch of information about it, a bunch of analytics, like its global ranking, the top 5 sites that refer traffic into that site, and then the top 5 sites that refer traffic out of that site. And so a great technique, if that site, whatever that site is, you know, you want to get on Oprah.com, if that's the site that that you have your sites on, you can use SimilarWeb to kind of look at what are the top 5 sites into Oprah, what are the top 5 sites out of Oprah, and consider that one rung down. And then you can look at those 10 sites, basically, if that makes sense, and look at the top 5 into that and the top 5 out of that. That's another rung down. And you can basically just play the odds, because I guarantee you, Oprah's people know who are those 10 sites are, and those 10 sites know who their 10 sites are. And so therefore, if you can just kind of go down the rung of the ladder a few rungs and then slowly work your way up. It does take a lot of time, and it's something that you really want to have, but if that's your goal, these are kind of the tools that can help you do it.
All right, sounds very interesting, and I appreciate that information because I know very little about that world. So it's interesting to me to hear how it kind of works on the back end. I am curious a little bit about urban fantasy. Folks may remember that Data Guy had a slide presentation at SIFWA, the Nebula conference last year, and we kind of analyzed it here on the show. And urban fantasy had like 11 million sales last year or something like that, but it was more than twice as many as any of the other fantasy subgenres. So I'm curious if you found launching your series this past summer, you know, it's like you can really kill it if you can rank well and actually stay up there, but it's super competitive for a fantasy genre. What was your experience?
Yeah, so this is the what I did right and what I did wrong, and I could definitely tell you what I did wrong and even though this is relatively fresh, there are things that I would have absolutely changed. So what I did right is that I got a good cover and I really worked on the branding. So one of the things that was really apparent was I have a female protagonist, and so I went on to Amazon. I kind of scoured all the covers, what is expected of my genre, and what I saw there were certain colors that stood out over others. So blues and reds, for example, seemed to be a common color. Purple seemed to be another one. The hero staring off into the middle distance, that kind of stuff. And then I created a little emblem with a weird Venetian mask as my branding. And that worked very well. I got comments on that. I had people recognizing the masks and actually saying, oh, I saw that somewhere. And, there was that little recognizable piece that, same but different. The other thing that was absolutely instrumental and really surprising, I have to say, was I reached out to many heavy hitters in my genre. So I reached out to 19 heavy hitters and 17 responded. 3 said no, very polite. Sorry, 2 said no, very politely. The other 14 said yes. And of that 14, 13 actually came out for me during launch week. And so I did the whole staggered launch thing, which I know you guys have covered many times. I can say that the mistake I made was I made the window too long. So I over promos and getting heavy hitters to come out for my series. I did it over, I think, 11 days. And if I were to do it again, I would do it in a shorter window, 7 days. I would put more effort into AMS and Facebook ads in the beginning, which was something I didn't really try to do until about maybe 2 or 3 weeks after I launched. And the other mistake that I made was I focused on the US market only, which was a huge mistake because I was ranking incredibly well in Australia and the UK, and at one point in Canada as well. Although ranking well in Canada is sadly not very hard to do. My people don't represent. I don't know. But yeah, no, it was a mistake to not kind of continue doing the ads in those areas and building up all of that. That was one mistake that I definitely made. What was really interesting was the heavy hitters support. That I cannot emphasize enough. And now I spent a lot of time kind of cultivating these relationships. It wasn't like, but there were a bunch of them where it was the first time I was reaching out to them, but I was active on their groups and I was, kind of present. So I suspect that they had at least seen my name around before, but still 13 out of 19 actually pushing me was just massive. The other mistake that I made, which really probably is my biggest regret, was I created an advanced reader team Facebook group that I managed. So it's a small team, and they were super excited. I kind of got them in really early using my Facebook page, my existing mailing list for the previous series, all of that stuff. And I just failed at engaging them properly beyond book 4. And that was a mistake. And, I just started kind of only diving in once a week, kind of giving them small updates about the series. And I was really focusing on my fan Facebook group, but I wasn't kind of focusing on both groups. And that was a big error because, like you said, there's so much urban fantasy going on that if you don't constantly engage, they will find you, or they will find the next best thing. And I definitely saw some of my, what I would call my peeps in other writers groups. And I'd be like, oh, Stu, I lost you, Stu, come back. But such is life.
Such is life. This is probably a pretty quick question, but it's something that often comes to mind with this sort of thing. We keep on comparing urban and epic just because they're sort of the two top of the fantasy genre. Epic fantasy is known for having an extremely long length of stories, both the individual stories and the overall series. How does urban fantasy compare? Like, is there a sweet spot in length like that?
So I think the sweet spot based on my studies is around 50 to 60,000 words. My first series was 70 to 80,000 words. 70 to 100,000 words. And in terms of pricing and in terms of just general feedback and reviews, I saw no difference. So obviously it's easier to write a 50,000 word book than a 100,000 word book. With epic fantasy, from what I know, which is not a genre I write in, but I do have epic fantasy friends, the readers really expect tomes, like massive tomes.
Yeah, 100,000 plus. It's not uncommon.
Easily.
Yeah.
But okay, so let me ask you, Ramy, what are some common mistakes you feel other urban fantasy authors make that could be avoided?
Right. Okay. So I think the first mistake that really drives me crazy is that they think that just simply the presence of magic is enough now. You know, that might have been enough 20 years ago or whenever, you know, when Buffy was really popular, and, you know, that was,
Buffy.
you know,
I forgot about Buffy.
that was eye-opening. Oh my God, he cast a fireball and that kind of stuff. But now the audience is so enthralled by magic that just simply having magic as the driving trope, so to speak, isn't enough. You need other tropes that drive. So one of the things that I think has really helped with my series is that I use these kind of mythical creatures. They're real myths. I research all of the creatures. I bring them into the story, and I use their background to create cultural misunderstandings between, you know, the two groups. So for example, my main character's roommate is a Fey changeling warrior. And so the Fey warrior is stapling grass and plants and leaves to the walls, because that's what Fey do. They're all about outdoors and nature and stuff like that, and genuinely doesn't understand why her roommate is pissed off about this, right? You know, why does this bother them? I think that's what people are hungry for, and that's not being done enough in a lot of urban fantasy. And you definitely see the ones who are doing well in urban fantasy, they have these crazy little, you know, nut bar characters that add the flavor, and they're not just using magic as that crutch to get them to the finish line.
Do you feel it's important to have like vampires and werewolves and sort of some of those classic things? It sounds like you're kind of going a little more variety with some of the less well-known or less often used mythological creatures.
Yeah, I definitely am, but my main creature is an ex-vampire. So a vampire recently turned human who's trying to figure out how to be human again. So I do think that it's, you know, people want what they know and they want what they understand, and then you garnish it with the other stuff, right? You know, you garnish it with the myths and the unusual creatures. And I certainly, one of the mistakes that I made with the GoneGod world, my original series, was I just dove straight off the mythical creature cliff, so to speak, and started introducing weird creatures right from the get-go. And the one creature that everyone talked about was Medusa, because they knew who Medusa was. And that kind of opened my eyes, and I went, okay, I can drive off the mythical, creature cliff on books 3 and 4, but in the first few books, let's try to keep it relatively tame and slowly introduce the more crazy creatures. So that's why I kind of chose a vampire as my main character, but the supporting cast is, you know, definitely kind of out there creatures. Oh yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to have kind of some of the tropes that people love and are looking for, and then on the side, you can be a little more creative and do your own thing.
Yeah, same, but what's it called? People want the same but different, and then
Right.
that different can't be so unusual that they're kind of turned off and confused by the story.
So I noticed that your books are in Kindle Unlimited, and that seems to be urban fantasy. It seems to be one of the genres where you look through the top 100 and almost everything is going to be in Kindle Unlimited if it wasn't traditionally published. Did you experiment with wide at all, or is that you just knew right from the bat it would be easier to go that way?
Yeah, I did experiment with wide with the other series when I initially started, and I know that there are some authors out there who are killing it with wide. But for myself, what I discovered was that was really hard to target them well. So you could do some Facebook targeting, and that seemed to work reasonably well. But I've heard people have great success with BookBub ads to target Nook readers and Kobo readers and whatnot, and that has never worked for me. They just seem to like to take my money and not really give me any results. But I do think it's a skill like anything. You got to be willing to invest to learn it, and I would probably dive into that again, fully accepting that I'm going to spend however much money figuring out how this platform works. So yeah.
It's kind of interesting to me that the word count is so short for urban fantasy. I think you said 50, maybe 60,000 words, when so many people are doing Kindle Unlimited. If you talk to an epic fantasy author with a 150,000 word novel, they're making like $7 for borrow. Do you ever think about like, well, maybe I should make that first book real, a little meatier, and then maybe the following ones can be shorter? Or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I definitely have considered, what if the first book, because I know I have two friends who both publish 100,000 plus word books, and the book price itself is 99 cents, and they're spending a lot of money just kind of keeping the rankings as low as possible because they're after the KU reads. But what I find is that with Kindle Unlimited, what I've done, which actually was a really interesting experiment, and it worked quite well, was I basically stripped my back matter as much as possible so that once they finish the first book, they can get straight into the next book. So I think I have right now just about 2 pages of back matter and possibly a teaser. Some of the books I had a teaser chapter, and so that they would go straight in. And I have noticed that my Kindle read through, my unlimited read through, once I calculated that, is pretty consistent how it kind of goes through. It's obvious that people are continuing on with the next books in the series. What was interesting though, sorry, just on a side note, was that from my first book to my second book, I have a pretty good read through rate right now. And but I didn't right out of the gate. And what I was doing was I had a sample chapter for the next book, which is kind of the advice that a lot of people give, right? Give them that sample chapter, hook them in, and get them into the next book. But my read-through rate improved dramatically when I cut out that sample chapter and just had them go straight through. My theory is that my first book ends on kind of a high, happy, chirpy note. And my next book immediately picks off from that point, and it just kind of, follows that cheeriness, so to speak. And when I was using the sample chapter, which initially had been something in the middle, I went a bit dark and a bit gruesome. That didn't work. And I think since, giving them kind of the first chapter to the next book when they're on Kindle Unlimited especially, there's not really an advantage to that. So that was interesting, and that definitely showed me to experiment with the back matter. And what do you do at the end? Do you give them the first chapter of the next book? Do you give them a middle chapter? Do you not give them anything at all and just kind of say, click here for the next book? And my experience has been from just tell them, click here for the next book, and that's the best thing to do. So
it's interesting. It's amazing how many contradictory pieces of advice can both be incredibly successful in certain circumstances. All right, so actually I have a question. We're talking about KU. There's all sorts of reasons, compelling reasons to be exclusive to Amazon. KU is one of them. How central to your income are borrows? Like, does a substantial amount of your income come from KU borrows?
Yeah, I would say right now it's about 50%. I know other authors where it's much higher, and I know other authors where it's much lower. So again, it's one of those things where I wonder if it is the genre specifically, and it's also kind of maybe the way that things are set up. But yeah, it's about 50% that goes there. What's interesting though is, so I've tried these little experiments where I've just done AMS ads, for example, and then I did a period where I just did Facebook ads for a little while. And when it was AMS ads, my KU revenue definitely went up. And when it was Facebook ads, it was all about the sales, even though part of the Facebook ad said, you know, free and Kindle Unlimited. It definitely skewed. So I think the most honest answer to that is it depends on what you're doing, and it also depends on how well you and how patient you can be to capture the data and kind of sit with it. And actually, to answer your question earlier, Lindsay, that's probably what traditional publishing gave me, was the desire to capture data and to, you know, kind of just live in Excel sheets and kind of look at read-through rates and look at, you know, ad revenue spend and stuff like that. And, you know, it's incredible how deep down that rabbit hole you can actually get. So.
All right, Ramy, do you maintain a mailing list? And if so, what do you typically do to actively increase your subscribers?
Yeah, I do maintain a mailing list. I will have a sign up at the front that says, please join my mailing list. And I have a reader magnet, which is just a short story in my world, set by a side character. What I have found, though, is that by far the best thing to do, and this is what I'm putting all my effort in, is not the mailing list, but the Facebook group. And so it's all about the Facebook group. And even with the mailing list, if you want that free story, it's the pinned post in the Facebook group. That's where you get it. And so that's how, you know, and I'm just funneling everyone as much as I can onto that Facebook group, because the engagement there is just insanely high. Until, of course, Facebook, you know, turns it into a Facebook page and starts making you pay for, you know, but right now it's awesome. So.
Yeah, I'm a big fan, of course, of having a mailing list, and we just had Tammy on last week talking about mailing lists. But it is like, if you want to have daily engagement, I think that's where social media really shines. Most people aren't going to want to send an email every day, and if you do, you get responses, and then you time to, you know, answer into whatever their comments were on Facebook.
Right.
I liked your point about the sample chapter and experimenting. That makes a lot of sense, that for people in KU, there's nothing stopping them from just going to buy the next book. They don't have to decide, is this worth $5 or not? So I can totally understand why that would be the case. So we had Domino Finn on the show talking about urban fantasy tropes a couple years ago now, I think, and how important it was to nail them in this particular genre. Do you feel that's true? I know we talked about that a little bit, how you kind of maybe want the vampire as a core thing and then do some fun stuff on the side. Is this a genre where you have to write to market in order to be popular and make those top 100 lists?
So yeah, I think that, like, you need to give them something to hold on to that is very familiar, because for a lot of the readers, especially the more casual readers, the person, you know, the person who maybe reads a book a week, you know, they're kind of looking for that, you know, that dopamine hit, or whatever you want to call it, that kind of falls into a certain trope, whether it's magic or certain kinds of creatures. But I do think, and this has been reflected in some of the reviews that I get, is that it's being overdone. And so, you know, urban fantasy is a hugely competitive genre. So if you want to stand out in urban fantasy, hook them in with something that works. Vampires work, werewolves work, you know, certain wizards work. Thank you, Dresden Files. You know, like, these things definitely work. But then have something that is distinguishing, have something that sets you apart. And I think this is where designing your premise becomes hugely important. Because and that's what I, you know, to answer your earlier question, what are a lot of UF writers doing that are not doing enough of? I don't think they're spending enough time on what makes their premise unique. And they're just kind of going straight for that A story. The demon is coming to the city and is going to level it. We have to stop the demon, you know, that kind of stuff. And what makes your story unique? What makes it special? Why are the stakes? Why do the stakes matter here and not matter and need to be resolved. Like, why do I care if the monster succeeds or fails? And I think that it's just too easy to kind of rehash an old episode of Buffy and make it a novel. So,
right. One of the things that I'm curious about is we've had people come on and talk about, particularly with like micro genres of things like this is a problem in romance. There are people who are extremely faithful to their specific slice of the genre. And if they find you've mixed in anything from another genre, they will be outraged. Do you find that happens here? Like you talk about vampires, and vampires and werewolves are two things. And is there going to be a team vampire who, if they read the third book in your series and discover there's a werewolf, are they going to balk? Like, how pure do you have to be with your premise?
Yeah, I think in urban fantasy, you don't have to be that pure. That's been my experience with it. I'm sure there are other urban fantasy writers out there who completely disagree with me, but in my experience, being pure to the fantasy, to the tropes and the genre hasn't been that important. That said, and this is the bane of my existence, reverse harem, the number of times I get slammed because my book isn't reverse harem, because my book is ranking in the top 20 of suspense vampires, or I'm trying to remember exactly what genre it was, right? So it's like suspense vampires top 20. And I had someone actually email me and say, this isn't a reverse harem. And I responded and I said, well, how did you find my book? And why would you think it's a reverse harem? And her response was, well, I found it in this category. I think it was vampire suspense. And I genuinely didn't know what to say, but I went on to the category, and sure enough, the top 50 books, over half of them were reverse harems. So I'm really hoping reverse harem's a fad and it will go away, but I don't know. It seems to have some staying power, so.
All right. You touched on earlier that you have your Facebook group there. Do you have a social media presence on any other platform besides Facebook?
It's to be honest, Facebook's the one I put all my effort in. I am going to start putting more effort into Instagram, because I just occasionally put up a photo on Instagram, but yeah, I consistently get about 2 or 3 new followers a week. I do nothing on Instagram to deserve that. So I don't know why I'm getting that. I don't even think I really advertise my Instagram channel in any way. I pretty much just put up my book covers when they're relevant, and that's about it. And then a few kind of like random images.
I'd say that's all you're posting on Instagram, because I've had an Instagram account for a while, and I'm not really too certain what to do with it, other than every once in a while I'll post a picture of my dog, or maybe some book covers or whatnot. And it's funny enough, when I post my book covers, I get a bunch of likes and whatnot. But it's when I post the pictures of my dog is when I get the followers. I'm like, I'm not too sure what that says about me.
Well, you take them where you get them, right? This is a game of inches, right? If you could just get that one extra reader and that one extra, rabid fan, you take them where you get them. I don't know what I don't know what it is about Instagram, and I genuinely don't know why I'm getting this trickle of followers. So because I'm writing about unusual mythical creatures, there's an opportunity for me to kind of be posting, creatures and giving a little blurb about them and stuff like that. So I definitely will try that out, have a more concerted effort there. Instagram seems to be huge, especially with the hashtag Bookstagram and the other kind of stuff for YA. It seems to be a massively powerful force. I'd be curious to see how general UF will work there too.
Yeah, if you can get somebody that does character art not too expensively. That's the trouble I've had. Like, I've commissioned character art, but it's like $100. I'm like, well, I can't do this for 50 characters, for all my stuff. But yeah, find somebody cheap, and then that's the kind of stuff that's so cool to post on there.
Well, what I did actually that was hugely successful was I commissioned 8 pictures of characters. And then so one of my pictures, for example, is a Minotaur delivering pizza. And the caption reads, I used to guard the labyrinths of Minos, and now I deliver Dominoes, right? Something like that. But are you guys familiar with what's it called, the Humans of New York? So so this is like hugely popular photography Facebook, where what he does is he takes pictures of humans in New York, and then he kind of interviews them, and he puts snapshots of that interview up, and has like 20 million followers. So I did a few posts just for fun with my mailing list, and the Facebook group, others, because that's what I refer to all the mythical creatures as others of GoneGod world. And I would take that Minotaur picture, but then I would, just crop his eyes, or just crop his, furry paw holding the pizza. And I would do different captions from his perspective of, what it's like to be mortal living on Earth and stuff like that. And so in that way, you can make that single image kind of stretch out to be about a dozen images.
That's a good idea. And I can see why that would be intriguing to folks. That's sort of the hard part about social media. Like, if you're not selling tons of books yet, you really do have to be creative, just like you are as an author, in the way you approach it, and not necessarily just like, well, other people are posting their covers, so I'm going to go post my covers.
Yeah, I mean, it's real. Like, if you're trying to break into urban fantasy, that's really hard. Like, one of the things that kind of made me pause was, if I only had one book and I was writing an urban fantasy, how would I deliver that book and make it succeed? And, the best answer I could come up with is that I would publish that one book, try to get as much a following as I could while I worked on books 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then I'd unpublish it and republish it, and then do the rapid release again, kind of let my fan base know that I've done that. But outside of, kind of taking those risks and pre-writing a series in urban fantasy, you really need to have that home run, that lightning strike, to not just kind of be drowned in the genre. And it's interesting. I wonder, I wonder what it's going to look like in 5 years or 10 years. Is it just going to get more and more saturated, or are people going to be falling off to the side? I don't know.
That was actually going to be my next question for you, since you talked about doing 6 before you published any. Like, is that necessary right now? If somebody's, it's going to take them a while to write a novel, so they're just planning to publish one novel and then start working on the next one, can they still gain traction in urban fantasy, or would it be better for them to go, maybe I should try steampunk or something a little less competitive over here?
Yeah, so that's really interesting, because I've talked to some people who are like, oh, I want to write this book. How do I break in and stuff? And one of the things that occurred to me is that, when it's your first book, I mean, we all remember our first book. We're writing what we love, and if urban fantasy is what you love, you shouldn't just, especially if it's your first book, you shouldn't just jump into another genre because it's easier. If you can, do it, but otherwise, have that first book be what you love. And then, okay, so we're starting to see the indie publisher, like the self-published publisher, coming out, right? We're seeing this with Aeon 14. We're seeing this with LMVPN, where you're having these very successful authors who have this massive universe who are willing to co-author. And I think that might be one of the best ways to kind of earn your chops, so to speak, is by releasing your books as best as you can, but also, being present and being available and seeing if there are co-authoring opportunities or anthology opportunities or stuff like that. Because outside of kind of really kind of getting that, exposure right out the gate, unless you are rapid releasing, it's hard to get that visibility. And it's tough. I mean, my first book took me, I think 9 years to write, and then my second book took me 9 months to write, and then it's tough when you're just starting out and you don't have that speed.
Now, on the subject of not having that speed, like, is rapid release something you should shoot for, even if you can't keep up the release rate? Like, is a 4-book rapid release once a year better than releasing a book every 3 months?
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with that. And I disagree with a lot of the advice out there that, you have to be constantly releasing to keep the series going. I think once you kind of build your base and get enough readers coming in initially, you can maintain it with advertising. I know a lot of people, their strategy is just, boom, 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 boom. But with an effective advertising strategy, you can do it. The problem with rapid release is you don't know what your read-through rate is, right? And so if you've spent all this effort writing 4, 5, 6 books, and you don't know that you're going to get at least 40% from book 1 to book 2, and I mean, obviously people want it higher than that, but I would say 40% is probably the absolute minimum to really make it work. You're kind of sunk. And so that was a big gamble on my part. I knew, but I also had released a previous series very slowly, 1 book a year. And that series was quite well reviewed. So I had enough followers from that series that I felt like, okay, this wasn't a waste of my time. So that's why I would never recommend a first-time author, like whose very first book, to pre-write 4 or 5 books and then release them. Release that first book, get those organic reviews, see where the holes are in your writing. And if the book does well, awesome. Then just try to get the next 2 books out and, in a rapid manner. And hopefully those fans who read the first book and liked it will come for the rest. If the release went miserable, awesome. Because as long as you have some inkling that the book is good, but the marketing was off or whatever, just unpublish it and republish it as a rapid release now that you have your next books available. It's if the release goes okay that you're kind of screwed, right? Because you've got enough buyers that you're going to piss them off if you unpublish it, especially if you rebrand and retitle and all that stuff. That's what you're kind of not hoping for, is the middle of the road success for the one-off.
All right, let me ask you, have you released any of your books in audiobook format?
Oh, well, I have not, but I was signed by Podium at 20 Books Vegas.
So it's something you plan on doing then?
Yeah, I was. We'll be releasing them sometime next year. I would like to give you a date. I'm trying to remember if they gave me a date. I think they said roughly about 4 months. So hopefully around April we'll be releasing it. But it's interesting, actually, that you bring it up, because it was a long discussion with them about how to release it, because my books are 50,000 words, and with Audible, 50, I'm not exactly sure what the hour translation, but when you're spending that credit, you want the longer books. So the indecision was, I have 6 books in the series, was to release the audiobooks, book 1 and 2 as one audiobook, books 2 and 3 as, 3 and 4 as one audiobook, and 4 and 5, 5 and 6 as one. See why I write? I'm terrible with numbers. But you get the idea, right? So you get the 3 releases. It does come at the sacrifice of WhisperSync, but I think in the big picture, with the way Audible credit system works, it makes more business sense to do it that way.
Okay, my advice for you guys would be to actually publish an ebook that matches the audiobook, and maybe a print book also, because I think you're going to lose a lot of people, because they're linked on the Amazon page, and it won't be if it's not the same book. So, because I have done the 3-book omnibus, I had the ebook first, and we did that with Podium for my Dragon Blood series, and that's been far and away my best selling audiobook series, because there was never the individual books on audio. So it was always, they had to get the 3-book, 30 hours for 1 credit. It was a fantastic deal. So I definitely think you're going to do well like that, making it longer. I would just make sure it's not this lone thing out there without a matching ebook. So if you have any say.
Yeah, it was one of those things where it was a long discussion, but it was clear that they felt that was best. But I mean, there's nothing really stopping me from, I guess, combining books 1 and 2 on Amazon to kind of have that matching book. So yeah, thank you. I will definitely look into that.
Yeah, you might not want to take down the individual titles. But then too, if you try to get a BookBub ad, you might sell that 2-book thing for $5.99 instead of $2.99, and that might be more appealing to them. So.
Right. Yeah, no, that's awesome.
All right. Well, my last question for you is just that I know you've talked about this a bit. You've got 6 books out. You have a lot more planned. How are, you mentioned advertising. How are you planning to keep things selling in 2019 and beyond to keep getting people into that series?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of plans, and so I definitely one of the guys who have started co-authoring with some other authors. So we're introducing characters in the series to do spin-offs. That's one thing that's going to go. Then the other thing that they're doing is a concerted advertising campaign, where we're right now it's about the keyword mining for AMS. What are the keywords that work, and kind of trying to create long sustainable ads rather than just kind of recycling the keywords and hoping for the best. So that's another strategy, is just targeted AMS ads. And then obviously Facebook ads, which has been really amazing, to be honest. I know a lot of people have been complaining about Facebook ads lately, but for me, it's been going really well, especially because my books are set in Canada. So I have a Facebook, my first book is 99 cents. And I have a Facebook ad that says vampires in Canada. And then I target, it's all set at McGill University. And I target people who went to McGill University. And that ad is breaking even just off of the sale of book 1. So that's been going really well. So it's that kind of stuff. The one thing I will say that I am keeping my eye on is read-through rates. So I do have it planned for this series that it will go to book 9, and then I'm cutting that series, and I'm going to have the same hero in another timeline and have another series there, just to kind of keep those series separate. And had it made sense, I would have done it earlier, but for the story, it really is about the cutoff at book 9. And then beyond that, at least a book every 6 weeks. So at least 50,000 words every 6 weeks.
Okay. Another quick question, just sort of regarding that. Like, do you think that going forward, your advertising dollar is going to mostly be dedicated to your most recent project, shall we say? Or are you, do you think you're always going to be sort of funneling people back to a book 1 and having a long tail on your backlist?
Yeah, I definitely would do the long tail on the backlist. Obviously, it needs to be profitable. And that's another, that's another thing from traditional publishing, to be honest, is that traditional publishers live off of their backlist. They live off of the trickle of sales that they get from that backlist, and the hope that, X, Y, or Z is happening in the news, and they have some book that's somewhat relevant to that event, so they're going to push it, and you certainly see that with the mega sellers and traditional publishers like Kite Runner, even Harry Potter, with being, the infamous story of being banned from a library or wanting to be banned from a library, having that kind of connection. So I definitely will always have my eye on the backlist, and I will do my best to never let them die away. Of course, if it doesn't make financial sense, that will be the ultimate decider. So in other words, Excel will be the ultimate decider.
Yeah, that sounds good. And, I mentioned in an earlier show this year that when I did the math, like this year's earnings, half was from the new releases. I had quite a few books out. It was a good productive year, but half was from all the backlist stuff. So it was very encouraging that continues to sell. And obviously the new releases help you sell the old stuff too, but it is nice to think, well, I can get to the point where I could probably slow down a little bit with the production if I wanted to, if the ideas would let me, and then you could just keep advertising the backlist stuff.
Right. But you write under a lot of pseudonyms, right, as well?
I have a pen name that was kind of a focus last year. This year I mostly wrote under my stuff. I'm more profitable than my pen name is, so but sometimes it's just like, oh, I have an idea and this is what I want to do, and I'm definitely guilty of following the muse instead of always the most financially advisable route.
Right, yeah.
All right, well, we've had you for about an hour, and I appreciate your thoughtful answer to our questions. Hopefully everybody got some good information out of this. Can you tell us where people can find you online, and maybe remind them of the title of your first book so they can check it out?
Yeah, sure. Ramy Vance, my first book is called Mortality Bites. So obviously you can find that on Amazon, and then you can find me, probably the best place is my Facebook group, which is Ramy Vance's House of the GoneGod Damned. So you can...
Clever.
You can send me the link to that and I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're trying to remember it.
And then I have a website, which I'll also send you, which is paradise-lot.com, which is kind of the fictional city where a lot of the stories take place, is in Paradise Lot. So.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you for joining this week from your chilly carriage house in Canada there. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much.
It's nice to meet you, Ramy. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
So long, everybody.